Hello, dear friends. I'd like to talk about the parsha of Bamidbar, the beginning of the book of Numbers, and the perikopa, the portion which is also called Numbers. I'd like to focus just on one issue. Of course, the book of Numbers is called so because in this first portion, the Israelites are being numbered as they leave Egypt in the desert. As it says in the beginning of the parasha, it's also, sorry, I should have. Yeah, this is in the second year of when they left Egypt, Su'ud Rosh Kol Adat Bnei Israel. In other words, to count all of those of the who are of the families of the people of Israel from the ages 20 until 60, which are the ages of the what's called army age for males. So actually, we only have a counting of the males from the ages of 20 to 60, which comes out to over 600,000 people. And that is usually the term that we use when we talk about those who left Egypt, when we talk about the 60 myriads or the 600,000. But in actuality, it was much more because they're women and children. We're talking about anywhere between 1.5 million to 200 million people, possibly. Say probably at least 1.5 million. And then there's also the mixed multitude that came out of Egypt as well. But there's an interesting story about the Levi'im, the tribe of Levi, which, by the way, was counted from the year of 1 month. One of the interpretations is that because the tribe of Levi was not part of the army, because they worked in the temple, but but in general, the Torah doesn't specify that. It just says to count them from the age of 1 month and above. And another possibility is because Levi didn't have land, that the responsibility would be on those who had the land. But anyhow, the Torah says in chapter 3 to count the Levi from the age of 1 month and above. And the Torah says that there were actually 22,000 Levites, or actually 22,300. So in chapter 3, there's an interesting story where Moses is told by God to redeem all the firstborn of the Israelites by the tribe of Levi. Now, this has to be understood. In antiquity, the firstborn was considered something which had, I would say, some type of meaning to it. The firstborn was considered the first power of the father, of the parents, when they were young. Like Jacob says in his blessings at the end of the book of Bereshit, Genesis, he says about Reuven, Bechoriata, you are my firstborn. Kochi v'reishit oni, you are my power, my energy, and you are the first of my physical strength. So there was something about the Bechor, the firstborn, which was considered very special in the family. And that's why in antiquity, very often kingship went to the firstborn. And I guess, and even in Torah law, in the book of Deuteronomy, of Devarim, the firstborn, the males receive the inheritance, and the firstborn receives a double portion in the inheritance and becomes the one who's in charge of the larger family, the Chamula. So here, the firstborn coming out of Egypt of the Israelites are being redeemed by the Levites. Why would that be? When we read, what is the firstborn? The firstborn is what you would call the natural pick of the choice person. The first one that comes out as if the first is the best. And in antiquity, that's the way things were seen. However, in the book of Genesis, you have a constant narrative of the failure of the firstborn. Adam and Eve have 2 boys. One of them is Cain, and one of them is Hevel. And Cain, the eldest, kills Hevel, kills Abel. It's the fall of the firstborn from day one. Abel is killed by his older brother, and because of that, the chosen one becomes Seth, becomes Shet, the third son. who about him it says that he was created in the image of Adam. It doesn't say that about any of the other two sons. So despite the fact the firstborn being Cain, the one who seems to be the chosen seems to be Seth or Shet. And then now among the children of Noah, it's a little bit hard to establish which one the firstborn was. You have Shem, Ham, and Yefet. Yefet is mentioned about being the big brother, but it could mean he was just bigger than another brother, or that another brother was bigger than Yefet. Rashi has a bit of a problem explaining that verse, Achi Yefet Agadol. Anyhow, it's not clear who the firstborn was on Noah. But when we go further and we see the sons of Terach, so Terach has three sons. That's Abraham's father. Nachor, who is the firstborn, and Nachor is an idol worshiper. And Abraham, who is not the firstborn, is the one who discovers God, and God chooses him and brings him to the land of Canaan to inherit the land and be the ones whose offspring will become the chosen people. And Abraham also has two children. His oldest is Ishmael, born from Hagar, his second wife, and Isaac, who's born from Sarah, his first wife. But Isaac is the one that the verse says, Ki Yitzchak yikareh lecha zera, that your seed will continue through Isaac, God says, even though Ishmael will also be a large nation. And then Isaac has two boys also, Esav, and Yaakov. Esav is the firstborn by a few minutes, but he is not the chosen. The chosen is Yaakov. And Yaakov was given a special blessing in addition to the blessing which he is told to take by his mother. But the special blessing is the blessing to Abraham, meaning the blessing that Abraham received of the land and the children, which he receives in addition to the blessing which Rivka told him to take from his father. And then Jacob has 12 sons and a daughter, and all of these sons become chosen. However, Joseph has two sons, Ephraim and Manasseh. Manasseh is the oldest, but Jacob tells them that Ephraim, the younger one, will be the greater son. So each time in the book of Bereshit, of Genesis, there is this fall of the firstborn. In the sons of Jacob too. Reuben is the firstborn, but he does something. It says that he slept with his father's Pilegesh, his father's concubine. And he loses his right to the birthright. Shimon and Levi, who are next in line of Leah's children, so they also, after they slaughter the people of Shechem, who took Dinah, Jacob sees that as a terrible thing. And he says, I don't want my name to be within their assembly, he says in the blessings at the end of his life. And then Yehuda remains as the fourth son and the one who did not sin. And of course, Joseph and Judah face off because Joseph is the firstborn of Rachel. And Reuben and later Yehuda become the ones from Leah. And after all, didn't Jacob want to marry Rachel? So this face-off we also see in the last chapters of the book of Bereshit. But my point here is that it appears from the book of Bereshit that the Nivchar is always before the Bechor, that it's not the firstborn, it's the chosen one, not necessarily the firstborn. It's not what nature chooses, but what God chooses. That's what it seems to be. And here we have the Levites who were chosen by God to take the place of the firstborn who were chosen by nature. Now, that doesn't mean that there's no meaning to the fact that the firstborn might have had some type of status, because if there was no meaning, then the Torah would just say, okay, the Levites are instead of the firstborn. But obviously, there is some meaning because they're redeeming each one. Each Levite has to redeem another firstborn. The firstborn of Israel, there were 22,273. It says in chapter 3, it says here in chapter 3 from verses 44 to verses 51. So each one of the Levites, which were 22,000, had to redeem one of the firstborn. By the way, it appears there are actually 22,300, but there are also 300 firstborn of the Levites. So they sort of redeemed themselves. But the other 22,000 Levites had to redeem each one another firstborn from the other tribes of Israel. And as I said, there remain 273. The Midrash in Tanchuma asks how this happened and explains that it actually happened by lottery. Which of the firstborn would be redeemed by a person, a Levite, and which one would have to pay the 5 silver talents instead to redeem himself. Now, what does this mean? It appears the firstborn, of course, had some type of status of leadership. And I assume that the leadership of the tribes also were based on being firstborn that we read about here in the book of Bamidbar. Actually in the parshat of Shalach. But they are, of course, switched for the Levites who are going to work in the temple. And the Levites are going to be you might say, religious authorities instead of the Bechor. They're going to take away the religious authority from them, as they will be not only in the temple, but also the teachers. Now, when you have a switchover of leadership, and the old leadership was stuck in its ways, and the new leadership needs to have new ideas. So how does this happen? So in the Torah, it's happening by redeeming. And there's a new leadership now that they left Egypt. Now that a year has gone by and Egypt is behind them, it's time for new leadership. There's a lull in the wars. There was a war against Pharaoh. There will be wars against Sichon and Og, and there were already a war against Amalek too. So now there's sort of a lull in the wars. It's time to switch the leadership, to have new thinkers who believe in the destiny of the Jewish people and the goal. And they're the ones who are going to take over. But it's not easy to take over leadership. How does that happen? Because remember, the new leaders also remember the old leadership. In my opinion, this is hinted to in the 273 who are being redeemed by money. You see, two things can happen for an old leadership to learn a lesson. But an old leadership makes mistakes. It can learn its lesson in one of two ways. Either it realizes it made mistakes, and from the mistakes, you can learn your lesson, right? But how do you learn from your mistakes? Unfortunately, usually it happens in a very extreme situation where your mistakes brought on war, death, famine, major failure, breakdown, and then you realize, uh-oh, I made a mistake. But even under such compelling circumstances, not everybody's willing to admit they want to save face, blame it on somebody else. Yes, there were mistakes, but I'm one of many. It's not just me, it's everybody. Everybody wants to pass the buck. The best way to pass the buck is saying everybody was responsible, which of course means nobody was responsible. And we're familiar with that in these times also here where I'm living right now. So that happens also. And this is sort of like merumaz. This is hinted to in the parsha because it talks about the 273. What is the meaning of 273? In Hebrew, 273 is a numerical value of the word rega, which means a moment. And it says in the Psalms, Ki rega be'apo chaim birtzono. God gets angry for just a moment, but then he gives life to the whole world. What does it mean that God gets angry for a moment and then gives life to the world? Now, the simple meaning is sometimes God gets angry when the people are not doing the right thing or mankind is not doing the right thing, but in general, he gives life. The Talmud of Brachot interprets this slightly differently. The Talmud says there is a time in the day when God gets angry. And Bilam, the non-Jewish prophet from Midian, who was taken by Balak, the king of Moab, to curse the Jews. Bilam had a special ability. He knew when the moment was that God was angry at the world, including the people of Israel. And then he tried to make his curses at that moment of anger. What is the meaning of a moment of anger? What does it mean that God gets angry? God gets angry just like that. And there's a certain time every day that God gets angry. From the Bible, it would seem God gets angry when the people of Israel are doing the wrong thing, or when mankind is doing the wrong thing in time of Noah and the flood and etc. The Tower of Babel. But what exactly does that mean? Or even Sodom and Gomorrah? But what does it mean that there's a time during the day? This I understand as an idea. In life, there is a motion, a circulation of life. We draw in air in order to oxidate our blood, and it goes into the lungs, and the lungs bring the oxygen into the blood, which goes into the heart and comes out of the heart, etc. And then we breathe out the CO2, the carbon dioxide, which goes back into the air and absorbed by the trees and the grass, and they give out oxygen. We take that in again. There's a circle of life. And that's how our body works in general. There are cells that are born and cells that die. There's a constant circle of life. And also in ecology, there's a circle of life, life being born and life dying. And the circle continues. Now, in every circle of life, there is a moment which you could call the point of decadence. For instance, you plant a seed in the ground, and that seed disintegrates. So at that moment, it looks like this seed basically decayed and died, but no. After the seed decays, then it sprouts a root, and it sprouts a sprout, and it grows into a tree or into a flower, into a plant. So it's that decadence which creates the life. What the Lurianic Kabbalah would call the vacuum, the void that creates the new life, the decay of what was before in order to create the new life. And that's the way it works. Even when we breathe, we take a breath in, and it's held for a moment before we take a breath out. Now, if we wouldn't take a breath out, ever, we would die. If we wouldn't take a breath in, ever, we would die. So that moment of that pause between the breathing in and the breathing out is like a moment of decadence. It's the lull within the cycle, but it's part of the cycle itself. If you could isolate that moment, it seems to be a time of decadence. That's called the anger within the natural world. There is a moment where there's a lull because that's the way the system works. It constantly regenerates. Just like our body is producing cells, it's killing cells, or they're dying at least. So when the cells die, if they just die, of course, the whole organism would die. But they die and others come. But when they die, it looks like a moment of decadence. So Bilam knew that moment of decadence. It was called that rega, that moment of decadence. In physics, you have a point which is called absolute zero, where there cannot be any life. That is 273 degrees under 0 centigrade, when life is not possible anymore. That's absolute zero. That's this idea too, the 273 again, absolute zero, a moment of decadence within the natural world. So I see this as a metaphor, which means when the old leadership hits that moment of decadence, when it sees its decisions bringing destruction, then it asks itself the question, what did we do wrong? Now, good leadership learns from its mistakes. But then you have arrogant leadership will always try to pass the buck, or mediocre leadership will always pass the buck. Even if they learn from the mistakes, they'll keep going back to what they did before to justify the fact that maybe it was okay. So God chooses instead of the Bechor, that chooses the Levites. But the Levites also lived then. Of course, it's true the Levites were the ones who did not participate in the sin of the golden calf, and they stood by Moses in faithfulness when Moses said, "Who is for God?" And all of the tribe of Levi came over to him, which of course is also his tribe. And they slaughtered all the people. They killed all the people who had actually worshipped the golden calf, which was 3,000, not a large number compared to the amount of Israelites who were actually there, who I said was in the millions. But the real reason why the Levites are the ones who are chosen, my opinion, is because they will be the teachers. As Moses says in the book of Deuteronomy, Yoru mishpatecha liYaakov, they shall teach your precepts, your Torah to Jacob. Yoru mishpatecha liYaakov, they shall teach your precepts to Jacob and your Torah to Israel. And it says also in the prophets, Kisifte Kohen, for the lips of the Kohen, who's also a Levi. Yishmeru Dad will watch over knowledge. V'Torah yalamdu mipihu, and Torah will be learned from his lips, because he is a messenger, almost like an angel of God. So the Levites are the ones who are the teachers. Now, the true character of a teacher is somebody who learns from their mistakes. And therefore, they're the best type of leadership. Because when you see the mistake and you say, okay, what can I learn from this mistake? That's how leadership develops. There are no leaders who make no faults. But the leaders who make faults and learn from their faults, they can continue being leaders because they will constantly learn. Hopefully they won't make too many faults. But if they're not willing to learn from their faults because of arrogance, so then they will just bring catastrophe. So here you have this movement from the old leadership to the new leadership after a year has gone by from leaving Egypt. And this leadership, which is now facing the failure of the old leadership, the sin of the golden calf, and sometimes not wanting to leave Egypt, not believing in the path, the new leadership has to be educators who know how to learn from mistakes and rebuild themselves and the people around them under such circumstances. Shalom, shalom.